Hi, I'm Dan Vogel. Thanks for joining me. Imagine seeing Joseph Smith step behind a curtain hung in the corner of his home in Harmony, Pennsylvania, and in process of time emerge with a facsimile of characters much like these, claiming that he had copied them from the gold plates. What would you do with these characters? Well, if you're Martin Harris, you take a long wagon ride to New York City seeking learned opinion, asking, are these real characters? Can they be translated? What happens when the learned say they not only cannot translate these characters, but they don't recognize them as any specific language? In this video, the first of a three-part presentation on the Book of Mormon characters, I will discuss Martin Harris's request for these characters, his unsuccessful attempt to verify them, as well as Joseph Smith's attempt to explain the failure. In subsequent videos, I will be discussing the characters themselves, especially various theories about their possible origin. And finally, I will discuss how I think Joseph Smith created them. Now, let's discuss some of the historical background for these characters. Joseph and Emma were no doubt relieved to escape the danger and persecution that had begun to engulf them in Manchester. Yet, Emma may have been alone in her optimism about their prospects in Harmony. For her, the move brought the familiar surroundings of her hometown and the protection of her family. She may have believed that removing Joseph from the influence of his father and other treasure seekers would aid in her husband's reformation, allowing him to concentrate on the more pressing needs of his own family. Little did she suspect that his activities would again turn such favorable circumstances to ruin. For a time, Joseph and Emma lived with her parents. Isaac Hales said he was informed they had brought a wonderful book of plates down with them. I was shown a box, he said, in which it is said that they were contained, which had, to all appearances, been used as a glass box of the common-sized window glass, or about 10 by 12 inches. I was allowed to feel the weight of the box, Hale said, and they gave me to understand that the book of plates was then in the box, into which, however, I was not allowed to look. Smith evidently said the plates would be shown to a few chosen individuals at some future time, because Hale asked who was to be the first who would be allowed to see them. Perhaps sensitive to Emma's feelings, Isaac reported only that Smith said it was to be a young child. Other residents of Harmony were less reserved. Sophia Lewis, the wife of Levi Lewis, who was a relative of Isaac's wife, remembered that Smith said the book of plates could not be opened under penalty of death by any other person but his, Smith's firstborn, which was to be a male. Joshua McCoon, who married Esther Lewis, a niece of Isaac's wife, said Smith told him that Smith's firstborn child was to translate the characters and hieroglyphics upon the plates into our language at the age of 3 years. By this time, Emma was 3 or 4 months pregnant. While Smith correctly predicted the infant's sex, he did not foresee that the child would die shortly after birth. The reports of the Harmony neighbors and relatives are supported by Willard Chase, who independently recalled what Martin Harris said following his return to Palmyra, having just spent the spring of 1828 in Pennsylvania as Smith's scribe. Harris said that the prophet's wife in the month of June following would be delivered of a male child that would be able when 2 years old to translate the Gold Bible. It is difficult to imagine what Smith might have had in mind for the child, but to claim that he would translate the Gold Bible is problematic, because the translation had already commenced prior to the baby's birth. Perhaps it was meant that the child would translate another record. Regardless, Isaac became irritated by the idea of the plates being in his home, and informed his son-in-law that if there was anything in my house of that description which I could not be allowed to see, he must take it away. If he did not, I was determined to see it. After that, Hale said, the plates were said to be hid in the woods. Joseph and Emma soon moved into a small 1.5-story house, formerly occupied by Emma's older brother Jesse, who had recently acquired his own farm. The house sat in the center of a 13.5-acre strip of land, running north of the house to the Fuego Mountains, near the site of the old Spanish mine, and south to the Susquehanna River. On the north side of the road, opposite the house, sat a barn. About 450 feet west was Isaac Hale's residence. Just beyond was Nathaniel Lewis's, and some 250 feet east of Joseph and Emma's home was the Macune Cemetery. Frederick G. Mather described the Smith home after visiting Harmony in July 1880 as a partly finished house, 26 feet broad, 18 feet deep, and 14 feet in the posts. Rex B. Howes, who lived in the house from 1896 to 1909, said the Smith home was built of lumber, having 2 rooms downstairs. The floor downstairs was of beautiful hardwood maple. When entering the house, one came into a hallway, and there a stairway led up to an attic loft. The east end of this loft was boarded off into a room, with a window looking toward the east. I was told that Joseph Smith did a lot of writing in this room. Another stairway, underneath the attic stairway, led down to the cellar underneath the house. There was a nice fireplace at the west end of the house. Once the Smiths were comfortably situated, the plates came out of hiding. Joseph had by this time procured a trunk for the plates, which was said to have been made by Benjamin Wasson, Emma's brother-in-law from Colesville. Martin Harris recalled that the plates were usually kept in a cherry box made for that purpose. This may have been the same trunk that Lucy Smith said she saw about September 1828 on Emma's bureau, which she described as a red Morocco trunk. Emma told one interviewer that the plates lay under our bed for a few months, but I never felt the liberty to look at them. Occasionally, Joseph left them on the table, giving Emma an opportunity to feel them through the cloth covering. I felt the plates as they lay on the table, tracing their outline and shape, she recalled. They seemed to be pliable like thick paper, and would rustle with a metallic sound when the edges were moved by the thumb, as one does sometimes thumb the edges of a book. Smith said he began copying some of the characters from the plates a short time after his arrival in Harmony. Recalling this event in 1838, he said, I copied a considerable number of them, and by means of the Urim and Thummim, I translated some of them, which I did between the time I arrived at the house of my wife's father in the month of December 1827 and the February following. In February, Martin Harris came to Harmony to take samples of the characters to some experts in ancient languages in New York City and elsewhere. In his 1832 account, Smith related the circumstances that had brought Harris to Harmony. The Lord appeared unto Harris in a vision, and showed unto him his marvelous work, which he was about to do. And he immediately came to Susquehanna, and said the Lord had shown him that he must go to New York City with some of the characters. So we proceeded to copy some of them. Harris later reported that Smith copied the characters while shielded from view by a curtain hung across the corner of the room. Taking Smith's facsimile of characters, Harris jumped into his wagon and headed north towards Utica, then east through Albany and finally to New York City, seeking learned opinion along the way. In Manhattan, he solicited the opinion of the well-known authority on American antiquities, Samuel L. Mitchell, who nevertheless declined to offer an opinion, and instead directed Harris to Charles Anthon, Columbia University's renowned classical scholar and linguist. Anthon was alone in his study when Harris showed him the facsimile of characters. Exactly what transpired between the two men would soon become a matter of controversy. The story of Harris's encounter with Anthon was already well known when Joseph Smith included a version of it in his 1838 history, which is told as if quoting Harris, who at the time was out of the church. I went to the city of New York and presented the characters which had been translated, with the translation thereof, to Professor Charles Anthon, a gentleman celebrated for his literary attainments. Professor Anthon stated that the translation was correct, more so than any he had before seen translated from the Egyptian. I then showed him those which were not yet translated, and he said that they were Egyptian, Chaldaic, Assyriac, and Arabic, and he said they were true characters. He gave me a certificate certifying to the people of Palmyra that they were true characters, and that the translation of such of them as had been translated was also correct. I took the certificate and put it into my pocket, and was just leaving the house when Mr. Anthon called me back, and asked me how the young man found out that there were gold plates in the place where he found them. I answered that an angel of God had revealed it unto him. He then said to me, "Let me see that certificate." I accordingly took it out of my pocket and gave it to him, when he took it and tore it to pieces, saying that there was no such thing now as ministering of angels, and that if I would bring the plates to him, he would translate them. I informed him that part of the plates were sealed, and that I was forbidden to bring them. He replied, "I cannot read a sealed book." I left him and went to Dr. Mitchell, who sanctioned what Professor Anthon had said respecting both the characters and the translation. It wasn't long after Harris's exchange with Anthon that it was touted as a fulfillment of a prophecy in Isaiah chapter 29, where in verses 11 and 12 it states, "And the vision of all is become unto you, as the words of a book that is sealed, which men deliver to one that is learned, saying, Read this, I pray thee. And he saith, I cannot, for it is sealed. And the book is delivered to him that is not learned, saying, Read this, I pray thee. And he saith, I am not learned." We will discuss Joseph Smith's misuse of Isaiah 29 momentarily, but first, there are several reasons to question Smith's version of the Harris-Anthon exchange. First, the claim that Dr. Samuel Mitchell sanctioned what Anthon had said respecting the characters and translation is doubtful. If such had been the case, Harris would have certainly requested certification from Mitchell, which no doubt would have been exploited by Mormon missionaries. In fact, Harris had first approached Mitchell, who couldn't help him, and referred him to Anthon. As Anthon remembered it, Harris called upon me with a note from Dr. Mitchell of our city, now deceased, requesting me to decipher, if possible, a paper which the farmer would hand me, and which Dr. Mitchell confessed he had been unable to understand. The claim that Harris returned to Mitchell and got what he wanted is therefore likely false. Mitchell had died in 1831, and unlike Anthon, could not protest the misuse of his name. Second, the claim that Anthon requested Harris to bring the record to him for translation makes no sense in the context of Smith's version, since it is unlikely that Anthon would continue to believe in the record's existence even after rejecting the angel story. More likely, Anthon's request to have the record brought to him preceded Harris's telling him the angel story. Until that point, Anthon may have entertained the possibility that the characters had been copied by an unskilled hand. Third, Anthon could not have pronounced any translation correct, especially from a jumble of languages that Smith attributed to Anthon. Indeed, famed French Egyptologist Jean-François Champollion had barely begun to decipher Egyptian. Mormon scholar Stanley Kimball researched the question of what Anthon could have known about Egyptian in 1828 and made this statement. Charles Anthon was acquainted with the latest discoveries pertaining to the Egyptian language, and specifically that at least a full year prior to the visit by Martin Harris, Anthon had studied the work of Champollion. However, this does not prove that Anthon knew Egyptian, only that he was familiar with its appearance and general structure. Champollion himself was just beginning to break the language, and could actually translate little more than royal titles, and demonstrate the interrelations between the hieroglyphic, hieratic, and demotic systems with Coptic. Therefore, not too much weight can be given the statement by Anthon that the translation was correct, more so than any he had before seen translated from the Egyptian, except that he saw the similarity between the Book of Mormon characters and hieratic or demotic Egyptian. While Kimball believed Anthon was pontificating and pretending to know Egyptian, it is more likely that Joseph Smith's version misrepresents Anthon, especially since the untruth benefited Smith and had the effect of validating his translation. Anthon repeatedly denied that he was ever shown a translation, or that he would have been able to confirm a translation had he been presented with one. In 1834, Anthon told E.D. Howe that no translation had been furnished at the time by the young man with the spectacles. On the 12th of August, 1844, he responded directly to the claim in Smith's history. You will perceive from this what a monstrous lie the Mormons are uttering when they say that I promised to decipher the piece of writing in question if the original records were brought to me. I told the man at once that he was imposed upon and that the writing was mere trash. I never professed to be acquainted with the vast number of languages of which the Mormons speak, and would deserve to be laughed at if I thought that any other language than gibberish were required to obtain a knowledge of the contents of the paper that was handed me. However, Anthon had previously admitted that he had told Harris that the facsimile of characters had evidently been prepared by some person who had before him at the time a book containing various alphabets, although they had been more or less distorted, either through unskillfulness or from actual design. Anthon may have seen vague similarities between the Book of Mormon characters and various ancient alphabets, but he couldn't translate those languages, even if the transcription were real. Anthon's statements about the characters in translation are supported by the earliest accounts of his encounter with Harris, as well as other independent testimony. Upon returning to Palmyra, Harris told the Reverend John A. Clark that Anthon thought the characters in which the book was written very remarkable, but he could not decide exactly what language they belonged to. A Rochester newspaper reported in 1829 that Harris claimed he went in search of someone to interpret the hieroglyphics, but found that no one was intended to perform that all-important task but Smith himself. John H. Gilbert, who set type for the Book of Mormon, reported that Harris returned from New York City, satisfied that Joseph was a little smarter than Professor Anthon. In 1870, Harris reportedly said that the most learned men had exhausted their knowledge of letters in the vain effort to decipher the characters. In his 1832 history, Smith clearly states that he did not translate the characters until after Harris had returned with the facsimile. And he, Harris, returned to me and gave the characters to me to translate. And I said, I cannot, for I am not learned. But the Lord had prepared spectacles for to read the book. According to Oliver Cowdery's 1835 history, the angel told Joseph Smith in 1823 that the plates cannot be interpreted by the learning of this generation. This is consistent with Moroni's declaration in the Book of Mormon that none other people knoweth our language. E.D. Howe solicited Anthon's statement in 1834 not because the Mormons were saying he had verified Smith's translation, but because they were claiming that he had pronounced the Book of Mormon characters true Reformed Egyptian hieroglyphics. At some point, Smith decided he needed scholarly support for his translation abilities. This need showed up while he negotiated with Michael H. Chandler for the purchase of some Egyptian papyri in Kirtland, Ohio in July 1835. According to Oliver Cowdery's report, Smith showed Chandler a number of characters like those upon the writings of Mr. Chandler, which were previously copied from the plates, containing the history of the Nephites, or Book of Mormon. At Chandler's request, Smith gave him the interpretation of some few characters for his satisfaction. At this time, Smith obtained a certificate from Chandler, which was published in the Messenger and Advocate in December 1835, certifying that Smith's translation corresponded in the most minute matters to information he obtained from the most learned in many eminent cities. While there is good reason to treat such an affidavit from a hopeful seller with skepticism, Joseph Smith undoubtedly gained credibility as a translator with the publication of Chandler's affidavit. Smith also received indirect support for his translation of the Book of Mormon characters. Later, while dictating his history in 1838 in Missouri, he tried to use the Harris-Anthon exchange to achieve the same objective. However, in doing so, he created anachronisms and exposed himself to contradiction. A major contradiction occurred in the way Isaiah 29 was fulfilled. In Smith's 1832 history, Harris took the characters to the learned, saying, "Read this, I pray thee." And the learned said, "I cannot." But if he would bring the plates, they would translate it. But the Lord had forbid it. And he returned to me and gave them to me to translate. And I said, "I cannot, for I am not learned." But the Lord had prepared spectacles for to read the book. Therefore I commenced translating, and thus the prophecy of Isaiah was fulfilled, which is written in the 29th chapter concerning the book. Thus, in Smith's 1832 history, Isaiah's prediction was fulfilled because the learned could not read the characters. However, in 1838, both Anthon and Mitchell verify Smith's translation, and so Isaiah 29 had to be fulfilled in a different way. Smith therefore awkwardly put the words, "I cannot read a sealed book," into Anthon's mouth. More than a year after the Harris-Anthon exchange, Joseph Smith dictated Nephi's prophecies about the latter days, which included his use of Isaiah 29 as a proof text for the Book of Mormon. However, Smith changed Isaiah to make it more suitable for Harris's 1828 encounter with Anthon, adding, for instance, "And the learned shall say, Bring hither the book, and I will read them. And now, because of the glory of the world, and to get gain, they will say this, and not for the glory of God. And the man shall say, I cannot bring the book, for it is sealed. Then shall the learned say, I cannot read it." Thus, in Nephi's version, the learned request that the book be brought to them, which does not happen in Isaiah's metaphor, for the simple reason that it is the sealed book itself, not a facsimile of characters, that is brought to the learned. Later, while working on his inspired revision of the Bible in 1833, Smith used 2 Nephi chapters 26 and 27 to restore the text of Isaiah 29. Needless to say, the revision Smith made to Isaiah 29 lacked support in the ancient manuscripts. In fact, the oldest extant text of Isaiah found at Qumran, which dates to the 2nd century BCE, prior to the supposed alteration of the Bible by the great and abominable church, does not support Smith's version. This manipulation of the text has led Mormon author Robert A. Cloward to concede that the original of Isaiah 29 cannot be construed to foretell the Book of Mormon, and that Nephi, therefore, must have likened Isaiah 29 to his own circumstances, formulating an original prophecy that gave the old scripture new significance and saw fulfillment in the Book of Mormon. Thus, Nephi transforms Isaiah's prophecy about Jerusalem's destruction into one about the destruction of the Nephites, and elsewhere turns Isaiah's figurative language into literal fulfillment in the Book of Mormon. Isaiah knew that his audience would not understand his message, for they were spiritually asleep and blind. To illustrate his point, Isaiah used the metaphor of a sealed book or scroll, which neither the learned nor unlearned could read. "And the vision of all is become unto you as the words of a book that is sealed, which men deliver to one that is learned, saying, Read this, I pray thee. And he saith, I cannot, for it is sealed. And the book is delivered to him that is not learned, saying, Read this, I pray thee. And he saith, I am not learned." In other words, Isaiah's message is like a sealed book, which neither the scribes, the learned, by their reliance on human wisdom, nor the laity, because of their ignorance, can understand. The book, Isaiah's message, is not literally sealed, although it may as well be, given the misunderstanding of his audience. The book is sealed only as a figure of speech, a metaphor that represents spiritual illiteracy. Thus, it is a vision that has become as the words of a book that is sealed. Smith transformed this into a prophecy about a literal book, the Book of Mormon, by having Nephi predict, "And it shall come to pass that the Lord God shall bring forth unto you the words of a book, and they shall be the words of them which have slumbered." The reference to those who have slumbered comes from Isaiah 29:10, which states that God has poured out upon you the spirit of deep sleep. The you in Isaiah was his audience, those in spiritual apostasy. Hence, they were not the ones who wrote the book, as Smith interpreted. They were those who could not read the book. Whereas Nephi interpreted sleep as a metaphor for physical death, for Isaiah, it was spiritual slumber. With obvious reference to Harris and Anthon, Nephi prophesies with a clarity Isaiah would have envied. "The book shall be delivered unto a man, and he shall deliver the words of the book, which are the words of those who have slumbered in the dust. And he shall deliver these words unto another." Playing on the phrase, "the words of a book," Smith explains that as with Harris and Anthon, it is the words of the book that are delivered to the learned, not the book itself. However, Smith's interpretation renders Isaiah's metaphor essentially meaningless. The learned can't read the book because it is sealed, not because it is written in an unknown language. This is fully conceded by Cloward, who writes, "Isaiah lamented in Isaiah 29:11 that the vision of Jerusalem's people has become as the words of a sealed book. No specific book is mentioned. Isaiah's concern was the lost vision of his people, not books. His expression is symbolic, a simile, one of many similes and metaphors in Isaiah 29. It was Nephi who made Isaiah's symbolic book into a literal book. Nephi likened the symbolic book in Isaiah's simile to a literal specific record the Lord had commanded him to write on gold plates. Thus, while Smith touted Isaiah 29 as a proof text for his book, it is generally conceded, even by Mormon apologists, that Isaiah provides no such proof. Instead of fulfilling Isaiah's prophecy, Harris fulfilled Nephi's prediction, which was dictated by Smith more than a year after the fact.